For full-length audio, you can listen to us wherever you get your podcast. And on YouTube, please consider liking and subscribing for new content every week. And now, on to the video. In July of 1947, a rancher named W.W. Mac Brazel and a friend's son were driving across their ranch land. It was about some 80 miles northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. And that's why they encountered something they'd never seen before. While these ranchers were trying to drive their sheep, they came across in Brazel's words, a large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tinfoil, and rather tough paper and sticks. And as a lot of animals would do with something that they are maybe afraid of, they would not go near it. The metallic-looking lightweight fabric was scattered and shredded all across the gravel and sagebrush of the New Mexico desert. Brazel didn't know what to do with the newfound items or how they landed on the property, so on July 4th, he collected all the mysterious wreckage he could find, and then on July 7th, he drove it all to Roswell, delivering the goods to Sheriff George Wilcox. And what's funny is Sheriff Wilcox, he wasn't exactly overflowing with answers. He had no idea what this was, so he was pretty confused. So seeking answers, he did what I would imagine anybody would do. He contacted Colonel Butch Blanchard, and he was the commander of the Roswell Army Airfield and the 509th Composite Group that was located just outside of town. Blanchard, working his way up the chain of command, he decided to contact his superior, General Roger W. Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth, Texas. In addition to that, Blanchard also sent Major Jesse Marcel, he was an intelligence officer from the base, to investigate more thoroughly. Accompanied by the sheriff and Brazel, Marcel returned to the site and collected all of the wreckage, 3/4 of a mile long and a couple 100 feet wide of debris. That's a very large debris field. And it had been there for days, and no one was looking for it. They did the very best they could to figure out what the materials were. Marcel chose to make a public statement. On July 8th, Marcel's comments ran in the local afternoon newspaper, the Roswell Daily Record, alongside the heading stating, RAAF captures a flying saucer on ranch in Roswell. Now that was a pretty big statement, especially during that time. I mean, today it would be phenomenal, but even in those days, that was something huge. So going on, the body of the story contained dramatic, memorable sentence. Said, the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Air Force Field announced at noon today that the field has come into and in the possession of a flying saucer. And of course, the very next day, that very same department, they released a statement writing that the many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the Air Force 8th Command in Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through a cooperation of one of the local ranchers and the sheriff's office of Chavez County. The following day, the Roswell Daily Record ran a story about the crash and the RAAF's astonishing claim. But the U.S. Army officials quickly reversed themselves and on the flying saucer claim, stating that the debris was actually from a weather balloon. And then they released photographs of Major Marcel posing with the pieces of the supposed weather balloon, using the debris as some sort of proof. In a published statement from the War Department in Washington, they claimed that the debris collected on the Brazel Ranch was the remains of a weather balloon. And then, of course, the Roswell Dispatch morning's headline immediately read, Army debunks Roswell flying disc as world simmers with excitement. And this set the tale to the rest on July 9th. There would be a 1948 report from the government about what was now being called the Roswell Incident. Now, if you thought that the Roswell Incident was all by itself, well, I hate to burst your bubble, because there were some incidents that happened just before that. On June 21st, Navy seaman Harold Dahl, I hope that's correct, claimed to have seen 6 unidentified flying objects in the sky near Maury Island in Washington State, Puget Sound. The next morning, Dahl said he was sought out and debriefed by men in black. Wow. Now, 3 days after the Dahl sighting, an amateur pilot named Kenneth Arnold said he had spotted a flying saucer in the sky by Mount Rainier, Washington. And if that wasn't enough, in southern New Mexico, over 70 sightings were reported days prior to the incident. And by the end of 1947, a mass hysteria had seized the global mindset, with more than 300 alleged flying saucer sightings in the last 6 months of that year alone. In 1950, Frank Scully, a reporter for Variety, he wrote Behind the Flying Saucers. It was a book that detailed alien encounters from the Pacific Northwest to the towns of Aztec and Farmington, New Mexico, where aliens were now said to be landing their aircraft in people's backyards. For decades, many UFO researchers were skeptical of the government's change of mind in their accounting, and in 1994, the U.S. Air Force released a report in which they conceded that the weather balloon story had been bogus. According to the 1994 explanation, the wreckage came from a spy device created for a until then classified project called Project Mogul. The device, a connected string of high-altitude balloons equipped with microphones, was designed to float over the USSR, detecting sound waves at stealth distance. Now, these balloons would ostensibly monitor the Soviet government's attempts at testing their own atomic bomb. Because Project Mogul was a covert operation, the new report claimed a false explanation of the crash was necessary to prevent giving away details of their spy work. A little something on Project Mogul. Now, Project Mogul was conducted out of Washington, D.C. and the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, with some high-altitude balloon launches taking place in the high desert near the state's border with Texas. Now, typically, a Project Mogul balloon sent to high altitude stretched 657 feet from tip to tail. That's 102 feet taller than the Washington Monument and twice as tall as the Statue of Liberty. As balloons rode on the upper jet stream towards Russia, a long tail equipped with different types of sensing and listening devices trailed behind.
So I'm going to kind of start with the very first person.
Okay.
We've got the rancher.
Mm-hmm.
And when he found this, he ran across it on his land, and he couldn't understand what it was.
Sure. I mean,
okay.
he's a rancher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he decided, I think he had it for a few days, actually. And then he was like, okay, well, I need to take this because it didn't make sense to him.
Yeah.
So he took it to the sheriff. The sheriff actually handled the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And one thing that seems to be the same from everybody talking about at least the metal part of it is that it was lightweight,
mm-hmm.
and that when they tried to crush it, it would flatten itself back out.
Yeah, that's just wild.
So there's something there that's not of this earth. That's
Sure.
something that they had never seen before.
Well,
that
I don't
did
even
not
think
make
we
sense.
have that now.
Well, no, but that didn't make sense to them
Sure.
at that point in time. But there was also a mixture of that and like wood and stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when Marcel comes out, Major Marcel, he collects a lot of the stuff. He puts it in a box, puts it in the back of his vehicle, but he goes home with it first.
Right.
Okay? He shows his kids and his wife. They handle these items.
Yeah.
Okay, so he shows his kids how, it crushed and it flattened back out, and there was this wooden piece, and his son, remember at the time, said they looked like I-beams, but
Right.
there was foreign writing on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he does this before he takes it to the base.
Yeah, and guys, just to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, and I didn't necessarily cover this as much in my intro, but this is not an insignificant thing. This guy was an intelligence officer.
Yeah.
So for him to deviate from, from his core knowledge of what he's supposed to do for his job, he thought it monumental enough to stop off, wake his kids up, and say, hey, check this out.
Mm-hmm. So the next day he takes it to the base, or maybe later that night, I don't recall. And he gives it to his superior officer.
Yep.
And he looks at the stuff, right? And so we know, from the information that you gave, then he calls the next guy.
Right, chain of command.
Yep. And they decide at that time to release the statement.
Yep.
There's been a flying saucer, because they know that's what it had to have been, right? And then all of a sudden, Marcel gets called to Texas by the superior officer. Was it Ramey? Ramey, I think.
Yeah, Ramey, yeah.
And he goes, and as soon as he shows up and turns the stuff over, basically, he said, well, we're going to, have you make a statement. We're going to take your picture with the items. So when Marcel walks into the room, of the items that he supposedly recovered, they're not the items.
Right.
It is actually pieces of a weather balloon. Yeah. And this man was forced to take these pictures and tell the people that it was a weather balloon that he collected. And he was told not to say anything.
Yep. Yeah, he was told to keep his mouth shut. Mm-hmm. And I've been on the receiving end of some of those one-way conversations, and they tell you don't open that hole between your nose and your chin about this ever again.
This is not the first time we will talk about this, but
right.
He kept his secret for years and years and years. Now we find out that he did tell some family members some things. Mm-hmm. As he got older, he got more comfortable with living with the fact that he lied to the American people. Yeah. But he was an intelligence officer. He had lots of secrets.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But in his older age, he's like, people need to know that this was all covered up. This is all fake. And there's interviews with him. You can probably go search it. Jesse Marcel is his name. And he doesn't go into complete detail, but he does say that there was a crash. He says that there was something there. It was not a weather balloon.
Yeah, and what's interesting, folks, and I know we'll may touch a little bit more on this, but you got to consider where we are in history and events. UFOs didn't really hit the register like they do now. This was still something really new for the world. So when they when Blanchard did the initial press release saying a flying saucer disc, although somewhat fantastical, was not as outlandish as it would be today, because it just wasn't part of the zeitgeist of what we do, with paranormal and everything nowadays. That just didn't exist back then.
No. So to kind of go backwards, we're going to flip back and
Tarantino
forth
a little bit.
Yep. So there are witnesses that said on July 2nd, which is when they think this thing crashed. Okay, they remember that there was a very large thunderstorm.
Yeah.
Near Roswell, that whole area where the ranch is. And they said that in between the thunderclaps, like there was lightning, and they heard like a huge explosion. And when they looked in the sky, they saw like a glowing red light. And they saw something falling.
Yep.
Because they could never specify when they thought it actually crashed, because he probably found it a few days later, and it took a few days, by the time he took it in and all that stuff. They don't know specifically the date of the crash. They just know when they went and collected things. Right.
And folks, if you've never been in the desert southwest in July, and it happens a little bit more where I'm from in Arizona, but it doesn't mean it does not happen in New Mexico. But we have these things called desert monsoons. And if I can go back in our way back machine of our relationship, Nicole had never been through one, and we were moving out to Arizona, and she got to see just exactly how powerful that storm can be. It's really like not anything that you've seen before. Now, you could have been through major storms and thunderstorms, but there's something unique about a desert monsoon.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
And you're leaving out parts of the story.
I know,
why
I'm doing
I was
it on purpose. I'm doing it on purpose.
We were moving. And I wasn't just sandwiched. I was like 3 bread sandwiched in between 3 semi-trucks going over a bridge over a huge, like a drop.
Yeah, it was a big drop. Yeah.
And it's pouring rain, and I couldn't see him anymore. I thought he had taken off, and it really shook me up. It was really, really scary.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
yeah, I mean, they can be pretty powerful, but to hear something like that they knew wasn't normal, it caused them to look out at the sky.
Yep.
Okay, so we also know, if you know anything about Roswell, people always talk about the aliens, right?
Yep.
And this is something that I didn't know, because I always thought it doesn't make sense. They talk about the aliens and the craft and everything, but when they talk about the rancher finding the pieces, they never talk about him. You know, you'd think he'd walk up on that and he'd see that, and that would be the end of it. He wouldn't be questioning what it was, right? Well, that's because there was a second crash that they didn't talk about. Okay, and it happened about 40 miles away from his ranch. And what they think happened is it came down, hit the desert, parts of it came off, which is where Brazel's ranch was. That's the stuff that he found. And then it flew another 25 miles away, 25 to 40, and that's where the actual crash was.
Right. The impact site.
Yes. So we have completely different stories from that.
Yes,
so
we
as
do.
far as Brazel and the sheriff, they just saw, like, the things that kind of fell off.
Sure.
Okay, so that makes more sense now. So I was like, surely he would have seen that. That's not something you miss, right? Okay, so we have testimony of a firefighter. So I guess he responded to this second, they're calling it the second site.
Sure.
And he recalls seeing a large disc in the ground. Okay, with several small, non-human bodies nearby.
Yeah, that's... First of all, as a first responder, you know, you're always with that knowledge of, hey, where we're going, you could potentially run into casualties. So I'm not going to say you're desensitized, but you're kind of prepared for it.
Well, yeah.
So I don't know if this firefighter gets there and goes, okay, were those bodies burnt? You know, is it so badly mangled that they're just not...
Well, but he knew...
Right.
By his statement of non-human, he knew
that it
something.
Right.
Well, you see that in the ground. If he saw he knows that's not normal.
Yeah.
And military officials pressured him to keep quiet. This is going to be a repeated thing. Keep quiet. Don't say anything. Don't talk about this. Every single person that has been interviewed about this, that has witnessed statements, says the exact same thing. Some are a lot worse than others. Depending on what they knew and what they saw. Okay, and then there was this Sergeant Melvin Brown who was on site during this mission to recover the debris from the actual crash site. So we're talking about the crash site.
Right.
So I'll try to specify that when I'm talking about this stuff.
Maybe we'll just call it impact site.
Okay. He was told not to look under this tarp that was there, okay? But of course, he's curious. When you're just like a kid, if you're told not to do something, what do? We do it anyway.
Our daughter
Because
does
there's
it
got
all
to
the
be a
time.
reason we're not supposed to do it, so let's do it, right? When he peeked, he claimed he saw 2 alien bodies. And the government, of course, denies his claims, but for him, he's like, I'm the only person to say they saw... beings recovered from Roswell. He thinks he is.
Right.
Up to this point.
Yep.
That is not the case.
No,
We've
most
got
certainly
more.
is not. Yep.
Yeah, a lot more. All right, so on to the next witness statement. So Sheriff Wilcox, the one that responded to the rancher, I guess he showed up at the actual crash site.
Okay.
Wondering what was going on, because I think he probably got calls that there was stuff going on out there. And this is a statement from his granddaughter, Irene Wilcox, because he, as well, didn't talk about it. Okay? And he says, or she says, that her grandmother told her the story of what her grandfather saw at the crash site.
Okay.
Okay? And the military was already there when he arrived, and, of course, was not happy to see that the local sheriff was there. He said he saw a spaceship that had been crashed, and he saw lots of aliens, some dead, some walking around.
Some walking around.
He said that the aliens were dressed in silk-like suits, and they had big eyes.
There's a statement.
The military took him back to his office. They surrounded him. And listen to this statement because you're going to hear it again several times. And a big red-headed colonel threatened to kill him and his kids and his family and possible grandchildren in the future if they ever told the story of what happened.
Well,
so that's
somebody
a deep
had
threat.
a secret to keep.
And the granddaughter basically explains that her grandfather kind of went nuts after this. Like, he just, and then they called him Crazy Sheriff Wilcox and all this stuff. So he suffered a lot after this. Because if you think about this, you're a local sheriff, you're known as a good man, you take care of the people, because it's a small little town that he's taking. Because this is not actual Roswell, this is a town,
right?
Near the ranch. Let's just be clear about that. It's not. And Roswell was still small at the time, but this is even smaller. So back in those days, especially, it's like, what's that old show? The black
Andy Griffith.
Huh? Andy Griffith.
Yeah.
So think about like Andy Griffith.
Yeah.
Okay. Andy Griffith. This is this guy, and he walks up on this. He sees a spaceship in the ground and aliens walking around.
Yeah,
What would that do to you?
Well,
and then told you're not allowed to talk about it. You can't say anything. And if you do, we will kill you and your family. And
I mean, you got to figure
that's scary.
He's a public servant.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say that in this day and age, our sheriffs and our elected officials don't care about people, but back then, especially in a small town, that was something to be revered. So as a public servant, you see this, and that's kind of your job. Your job is to go out to things like this, ascertain if it's a threat or not, if it's going to potentially be a threat to your community, and act. So yeah, I would think that as a sheriff of a small town like that in New Mexico, well, hell, any small town, really, especially in that day, that is kind of in your DNA at that point, to be a public servant and to protect the people that put you there.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's really actually like extremely sad.
It is.
It just bothers me a lot to hear that, because this is not the only story about this, like how, what's the word?
Lay it on me.
I'm trying to think of a perfect word for tortured.
Yeah.
These people were,
Tortured's
because you
a good
hear it
word.
again and again, like I just talked about Jesse Marcel, like at the end of his life, you find was like, well, I'm an old man now, if they come kill me.
Yeah, at that point.
But at least I've said something.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of what, and he doesn't go into detail, and it's some stuff that I don't think we will ever know.
Probably not.
But enough to say that it was a cover-up. It was not a weather balloon. There were aliens. He got something out there.
Yeah.
All right, on to the next.
Just a big opening onion.
So the following people that I will be discussing are all, most of them, I'll say most of them, are all people that actually worked at the base. Okay? In different clearances, of course. Like some of them were not high clearances. But one of these people is Frank Kaufman, and he was part of the recovery team at the crash site. Okay? So he had said that there had been a UFO in the sky that they had been tracking. Like, they didn't know what it was, if it was a plane or whatever it is. And they saw it go down.
Okay.
So they decided to go find it to figure out what it was, because remember, at the time they were worried about Russia, basically, the Soviets trying to do something. So that was primarily on their mind. Like, okay, they weren't thinking about aliens. They were thinking about, are the Russians here trying to do something? Because at that point in time, correct me if I'm wrong, we were the only ones to have the nuclear weapon. We were the only ones.
No.
And Russia was trying to get that intelligence from us, which is part of the reason we had the weather balloons and the...
We had been the
thing.
only ones at this point to weaponize it.
Yeah.
They hadn't quite figured that piece out yet.
Right. So they're extremely worried that, they're sending stuff over here. So they're going to go find out what this thing is. Mm-hmm. Okay. And when he arrives at the crash site, he says it's like a craft, but part of the side was open. Now, going back to what I said earlier, that there was 2 crash sites. And the first, they think it hit and then flew and then landed again. If that had happened, it could have torn the side of it open, right?
I mean, you got to figure it's coming in at such a high rate of speed.
Right.
I mean, you got to think about it in a much smaller capacity for skipping a rock, right?
Yeah.
And if it's a flat rock, it hits first, skips, and then lands somewhere. That's basically what this thing did. So yeah, if it hit its first spot like a can opener, probably cut a big old gouge on one side.
So that testimony really hits because it makes sense. Okay, so he says that when he walks up, he said that there was one body, and when I'm saying body, non-human body, was thrown up against the wall on the inside of the craft. One body was half in and half out of the craft. So in that opening. And then there were 3 other bodies inside of the craft.
Okay. Wow.
So we're at a total of 5 bodies.
Sure.
At this point. At least dead ones.
Okay.
Possibly. Is what I'm guessing by him saying that.
Well, we assume dead, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And he said the convoy loaded up the craft and the bodies and returned to base. And he said in Hangar 84 is where they hid all the stuff related to the crash.
I have to remember that. Hangar 84. Didn't know that.
On to the next witness. Okay. So this man was a pilot at the airbase. And his name was Oliver Pappy Henderson. And later in life, he told his wife that the Roswell incident was true. And he was the pilot that flew the bodies in coffins and wreckage to Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
Oh, yeah. I know that base.
He said he saw the bodies, and he described them as small, humanoid-looking, but not like us.
Wow.
They were certainly shorter than we were. They had pale skin and slightly slanted eyes, but had larger heads.
You know, a lot of things about that statement are just, first of all, floor me. One, you're the pilot and you're flying this stuff. First of all, I'd be scared out of my you-know-what in mind because here I am airborne with bodies of something that doesn't even exist on this planet.
Right.
So
I was about to say
one.
the same thing. I'm like, you're in this plane, like looking behind you.
Yeah.
One of these things like pop up.
Now
you
the
know,
other,
you don't know about.
Oh yeah, you don't
any
know.
of that
You
stuff.
assume they're dead,
Right.
but you don't know that for sure. I mean,
Right.
you're the pilot at this point.
Yeah.
I say, hey, fly this crap over to Wright-Patterson. Good luck to you. And you get airborne. You're like, I could just imagine flying this thing, and all of a sudden you look, behind him, and you got old almond eyes there staring at you.
Yeah.
But the other interesting thing is Wright-Patterson. Now, Wright-Patterson, if you don't know what Wright-Patterson is, it's a very, very well-known base here in the Midwest, but it is also the place where all the bombers, the stealth bombers are. So it's not exactly a low secret, low value target base. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this next witness statement is not a military person.
Okay.
And as I talk about this, I want you to remember what I just said about the pilot and what he said.
Okay.
See if you can recall what he was talking about, because this next guy has been discredited majorly by the military, of course, and they, said he was just a wackadoo, and that, even in the later, statements of them investigating the incident, they tried to prove that he was wrong and this and that. Okay. And that was something in this 1990 report
like
that they tried to come out and
95.
say it was Project
Mogul.
Mogul, and that the bodies that these people thought they saw, these alien bodies, were actually just dummies. You know, that they made them shorter. That's why they said they were shorter. And the skin match, you know, they said they were pale. Well, that's why, you know, because it wasn't real. They were dummies. They were that color. And like what'd they say, the like silver, like
The
suit or whatever. Well, that's what we dressed them in. And, you know, the reason they saw them, you know, is because we put them in body bags to keep them protected.
Yeah.
Okay.
Typical military bow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but why are you going to go to all that trouble? You know, you just drop them out of the sky.
Yeah.
Okay, supposedly. Let's say that. I'm doing air quotes, people. Supposedly drop them out of the sky, and now you're suddenly worried about the protection of them in the back of a van.
Yeah.
Let's put them in a body
Put them
bag.
in a body bag.
So that they don't get...
I just dropped them 80,000 feet, but let's put them in a body bag because we want to, preserve their,
It's crazy. It's crazy. And they, you know, and I'm going to read this statement from this guy and tell you all about him. They tried to discredit the people that he mentions, that they never existed, all this stuff. Of course they did, right? But I want you to try to remember previous statements that I've talked about, and I know there's been a lot. So, you know, if you got to rewind or do whatever you... But you'll recognize it when I say it.
For sure.
Okay. So this guy, he was from the town, okay, and he was Glenn Dennis. And he was a 22-year-old mortician at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell in July of 1947. He says, on July 7th, 1947, he received a series of phone calls at the Ballard Funeral Home where he worked from the mortuary affairs officer at Roswell Army Airfield. He says that the mortuary officer inquired as to the availability of child-sized caskets and procedures for preserving bodies that had been, quote, laying out in the elements.
Oh, so they're getting coffins for the dummies that they're dropping from Project Mogul.
Right.
Okay, fair enough.
But also, who else talked about coffins? The pilot.
The pilot, yeah. You're absolutely right.
He was transporting, he specifically said, coffins with alien bodies inside.
Jeez.
Okay. Later that day, he received an emergency ambulance call. So he also worked as, I guess, provided ambulance service. Because, you know, it's a small town, it's 1947. Yeah. You do multiple jobs.
I mean,
okay.
It wasn't that long ago that barbers were doing surgery. So.
Right. So he gets this call about caskets and child-sized people and how to preserve. Okay. Then he gets a call to respond as an ambulance to the site of a minor traffic accident in Roswell. The accident victim was a, quote, airman stationed at Roswell AAF, and he transported the airman to the hospital at the base. Okay? He said as he walked into the hospital, he noticed 3 military box-type ambulances, one or more of which contained what appeared to be, quote, wreckage.
Okay.
He described the wreckage as being inscribed with odd markings or symbols and bluish purplish in color. Now remember, Jesse Marcel, what he recovered at the ranch was what he said was like wooden looking pieces, but wasn't wood.
Right.
That had strange markings.
Yep. He sure did.
And something I haven't talked about is something, you know, that as an older man, he did an interview where he said, and he drew what these symbols look like. Mm-hmm. And they were purplish and pink in color.
Yep.
He says this in the interview, which I was waiting to tell you when we got to this, because
Sure.
it's something that, you know, coincides. Okay. He says that some of his wreckage was, it's not his wreckage, some of this wreckage was resting against the inside wall of the rear compartment of the ambulance, and 2 pieces of it, quote, looked kind of like the bottom of a canoe. So I'm guessing he's saying rounded like that.
Yep.
You know,
Yeah.
flat but rounded.
Yeah.
And if you think the shape of like a saucer, what they're saying,
Yeah,
that
it's
would
got that rounded.
make sense.
Yeah, sure does.
He described the other wreckage on the floor of the ambulance as being all sharp, and as best as he could tell, it was like broken glass. Now, what that could be, I don't know if it's the metal they're talking about, but something else I think I forgot to mention is Jesse Marcel, when he went to the ranch and he had brought that box home to his family. One of the things, which he didn't have a name for then, was these long pieces that he could shine a light through.
Yep.
Which now we know as
Fiber optics. Yep.
So could that broken glass actually be the fiber optics?
Absolutely.
Which all of a sudden, now we got fiber optics everywhere.
Oh, I've got a whole theory behind that. And folks, I'm going to tell you right now, my day job, I'm a network engineer and I deal with fiber optics. And I can tell you right now, every so often I look at that and go, how the heck did we come up with this? But and another thing to add to that, in my other lifetime, I was a medic. I was an Army medic. And Nicole will back me up on this. I had what they call as an FLA, which is a big box military ambulance. We can move 4 people in that or less. And I can tell you that we don't just, because of security and other reasons, we don't just throw things in there like the back of a pickup truck and take it to a local hospital. I can tell you that right now. We don't do that. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that in.
So, he says he also recalled observing MPs, which are military policemen, standing at the back of 2 of these ambulances. When he went inside the hospital, he encountered a military nurse who was assigned there and whom he was previously acquainted. He knew this lady. Okay.
Which that would make sense, small town.
Yeah. The nurse looked upset. She was covering her mouth with a cloth and told him that, quote, "You're going to get in a lot of trouble. Just get out of here."
Well, that's not ominous at all.
He also stated that he encountered a military doctor who was assigned to the hospital, a pediatrician with whom he was pretty good friends with, but did not speak with at that time. Having seen the wreckage in the rear of the ambulance and believing there had been an accident, he asked another officer in the hospital if there had been a plane crash. That's what you're going to assume.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Of course. The officer, whom Dennis had never seen before, asked him, quote, "Who in the hell are you?" When he responded he was from the funeral home, the officer summoned 2 MPs to escort him from the hospital. Before Dennis and the 2 MPs had left the hospital, he heard someone say, quote, "We're not through with that SOB, bring him back here."
Jesus.
When Dennis turned around, he observed a red-headed captain. Where have we heard that before?
I mean, the actual son of a bitch.
Or colonel.
Right, or
who
colonel.
said, "You did not see anything. There was no crash here. You don't go into town making any rumors that you saw anything or that there was any crash. You could get in a lot of trouble." So Dennis, I think, was a little bit of a hothead.
Oh, yeah.
He said he was angry about being called an SOB, and he informed the red-headed officer that he was a civilian, not under his authority, and that he, meaning the red-headed officer, quote, "can't do a damn thing to me." So the red-headed officer was supposedly threatened Dennis by responding, quote, "Oh, yes, we can. Somebody will be picking your bones out of the sand. We can do anything to you that we want to."